By August 1945, the Japanese carrier fleet was gone. Not damaged, not retired, erased. Out of every 100 men who had served aboard those ships, only 9 survived the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun the conflict with 10 proud fleet carriers. It ended with none. Every vessel either sunk, burned, or lay shattered in shallow harbors. The story of that destruction isn't one of sudden defeat, but of slow mathematical collapse. Japan's carrier arm didn't just lose battles. It bled out by arithmetic. At the beginning of the Pacific War, no navy on Earth could match Japan's carrier aviation. Its pilots were the finest anywhere, veterans of years of brutal training and precision flying. A typical trainee logged more than 800 flight hours before ever seeing combat. These aviators had perfected the art of carrier warfare. Their attacks at Pearl Harbor and in the early Pacific campaigns shocked the world. But the perfection that made Japan strong at the start would doom it later. The Imperial Navy built an elite corps, not a sustainable one. The system could produce masters, but not enough of them. As the war dragged on, the numbers turned fatal. By 1944, new Japanese carrier pilots arrived at the front with fewer than 50 hours in the air. Some had never flown in combat conditions. The once rigorous training schools were gutted, rushing men into battle to replace the endless losses. Every flight, every takeoff, every torpedo run drained experience from a system that could no longer replace it. Japan's leaders didn't see the crisis as arithmetic. They saw it as weakness of spirit. They believed morale could replace machines and courage could offset numbers. They were wrong. The story that follows is not simply the tale of ships sunk or aircraft destroyed. It's the story of how an entire service, once the pride of an empire, was dismantled piece by its own design, by flawed policy, by overconfidence, and by an enemy that understood the true meaning of industrial war. Japan's carriers began the war as symbols of technological mastery. By its end, they had become floating coffins for thousands who believed bravery could defy mathematics. Japan's greatest strength at the start of the Pacific War wasn't its ships or its weapons. It was its people, specifically its pilots. The aviators of the Imperial Navy were not just skilled. They were elite. Each one represented years of training, hundreds of flight hours, and the discipline of a warrior caste. They were the most formidable carrier pilots in the world. But behind that strength was a hidden weakness, one that would quietly destroy the entire system. The problem began with a single decision. Veteran pilots were never rotated home. In most modern air forces, experienced pilots are periodically pulled from combat to train the next generation. Japan refused to do this. The Imperial Navy believed every pilot should fight to the end. It was a policy born from a warrior tradition, one that valued sacrifice over sustainability. As a result, every loss was permanent. When an experienced aviator was shot down, his skill, his knowledge, and his years of experience vanished with him. No one replaced him in the classroom. No one trained his successor. Japan's pilot schools kept producing new graduates, but they were learning from instructors with fewer and fewer combat hours until, eventually, none at all. The effects of that decision became tragically clear at Midway. In just one battle, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Along with them went 322 aircraft and 110 of Japan's most experienced aviators. Each of those men represented over 2 years of intensive training. The loss was irreplaceable. Japan's training pipeline could turn out roughly 200 new pilots a month. At the same time, the United States was producing about 2,500. Run the numbers. Japan was losing combat veterans faster than it could train replacements by a factor of more than 10 to 1. The math was simple and fatal. But Japan's leaders didn't view the problem through numbers. They saw it as a question of morale. If the enemy had more planes, Japan would have more courage. If the enemy built more carriers, Japan would build more determination. It was faith versus arithmetic, and faith cannot stop bullets. By 1943, Japan's air groups were shadows of what they had been. Many young pilots went into battle after only a few dozen hours in the air. Inexperienced men faced American veterans with hundreds of hours in real combat conditions. The outcome was predictable. The U.S. Navy had begun cycling its best aviators back to training commands. They taught the next generation, passed on tactics and refined doctrines. Each loss was replaced by someone better prepared. Japan's approach was the opposite. Each loss created a void that could never be filled. Every month the gap widened. The Americans trained pilots en masse, supported by endless fuel, aircraft, and instructors. Japan struggled with shortages of everything: planes, fuel, and most of all, time. By 1944, the Imperial Navy's flight schools had become desperate. Training was cut shorter and shorter. Cadets practiced in gliders to conserve gasoline. Many were sent into combat having never fired live ammunition or landed on a carrier deck. The result was catastrophic. Each new battle consumed another generation of half-trained pilots. The war had become an equation Japan could no longer solve. When historians say Japan lost the war in 1942, this is what they mean. The math stopped working. The nation's most skilled warriors had been spent like ammunition, and the factories could not reload. Japan didn't just lose its pilots. It lost the very ability to make them. And once that skill was gone, every ship that carried aircraft was already halfway sunk. By 1943, Japan's carrier force was bleeding from more than just a shortage of pilots. Its ships themselves had become death traps. The Imperial Navy prized offensive power and speed above all else, believing that a perfect attack could win any battle. But that obsession came at a terrible cost. Beneath the surface of Japan's elegant carriers lay a system fatally flawed by doctrine and design. Japanese naval culture valued aggression over endurance. Damage control was viewed as defensive, almost dishonorable. The focus was on striking first and striking hard, not on surviving the return blow. As a result, Japan's carriers were never built to take punishment. Their crews received minimal training in firefighting or emergency procedures. When disaster struck, they were often left with little more than buckets and hoses. The United States Navy took a different approach. Every sailor, from pilot to cook, was drilled in damage control. American carriers had extensive fire suppression systems, reinforced bulkheads, and practiced response teams. Japanese carriers had none of that. The results were predictable and horrific. Take the case of Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier at the time. She was designed to be tougher than any before her, with an armored flight deck and modern systems. But in June 1944, one American torpedo struck her hull. It should have been survivable. Instead, the ship's ventilation remained running, spreading volatile aviation fuel vapors throughout the interior. 6 hours later, a single spark turned Taiho into a floating bomb. The explosion ripped her apart, killing hundreds and sinking her beneath the waves. Then there was Shokaku, one of Japan's veteran carriers from Pearl Harbor. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she took 3 direct bomb hits from American dive bombers. Within 20 minutes, she was burning end to end. Fuel fires and exploding munitions tore through her decks. Over 1,300 men died. Those who leapt into the sea were caught in flames spreading across the oil-covered water. The tragedy wasn't just in the loss of ships. It was in how preventable it all was. Japan's carriers were designed to carry as many aircraft as possible. Efficiency and safety were sacrificed for capacity. Planes were crammed into hangars, passageways, and even the flight deck itself. The carrier Akagi, for example, carried 91 aircraft in spaces meant for 60. That decision turned every hangar into a powder magazine. When a single American bomb punched through the flight deck, it didn't just destroy 1 or 2 planes, it detonated 20, each loaded with fuel and ordnance. The resulting chain explosions consumed entire decks. Survivors described the hangars as crematoriums of steel, engulfed in gasoline-fed infernos. The Americans armed and fueled their aircraft on the open deck, where fires could be contained or jettisoned overboard. The Japanese did this work inside enclosed hangars, surrounded by ammunition and confined metal walls. It was a doctrine built for destruction. Every successful American airstrike exposed these flaws. Every lost carrier proved that courage and training could not compensate for engineering that ignored survival. The Imperial Navy had designed its carriers as weapons of offense. But by 1944, those same design choices ensured that each ship was also a weapon of self-destruction. What began as symbols of national pride and technological mastery had become floating tombs. And when the flames died down, Japan wasn't just losing ships, it was losing generations of trained men trapped inside them. Every navy fights according to its beliefs. For Japan, that belief was simple: Attack first, hit hard, and trust the spirit of the warrior to carry the day. But doctrine built on pride can blind even the strongest fleet. By 1944, Japan's naval philosophy had become a trap, one that turned every carrier engagement into a potential massacre. The Imperial Navy saw aircraft as extensions of the samurai code. Pilots were trained to think of themselves as weapons, not as men. Their commanders believed that superior will could overcome inferior numbers. In the early years, this confidence worked. But as the war dragged on, that same mindset became deadly. One of the most critical mistakes was operational doctrine, how Japan prepared, armed, and launched its planes. American carriers fueled and armed their aircraft on the open flight deck. If something went wrong, a damaged plane or leaking fuel could be shoved overboard. Fires could be isolated and extinguished in the open air. Japan, by contrast, armed and fueled its aircraft inside enclosed hangars, below deck, surrounded by bombs, gasoline, and men. It was a recipe for disaster. When an American dive bomber found its mark, one bomb didn't just destroy a plane. It triggered an inferno. The confined hangars trapped the blast, amplifying it into a chain of detonations. Dozens of aircraft ignited together, their bombs cooking off in seconds. The heat, pressure, and fumes turned every carrier into a sealed furnace. The carrier Kaga showed the full horror of this flaw. During the Battle of Midway, 4 bombs struck her flight deck in less than 10 minutes. Each found a hangar packed with fueled and armed aircraft. The ship erupted in a rolling explosion that killed 701 men. Survivors described rivers of burning fuel pouring through passageways, trapping anyone below deck. Within 9 minutes, Kaga was finished. But the danger didn't end with bombs. Japan's carriers were also blind compared to their American counterparts. Until 1944, most Japanese ships lacked radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. Their gunners aimed manually, relying on eyesight and intuition to hit aircraft moving over 400 miles per hour. Expected hit rates hovered around 2%. By contrast, American carriers had radar fire control systems that calculated enemy positions and adjusted gunfire automatically. Their hit probability rose to nearly 18%. That difference wasn't luck. It was technology, and it meant life or death for thousands of sailors. The U.S. Navy fought with science. Japan fought with courage. But courage can't track a plane through the clouds. The result was predictable. Japanese carrier groups were torn apart by swarms of American dive bombers and torpedo planes. Their anti-aircraft fire barely scratched the enemy. Pilots went down faster than they could be replaced. The skies that once belonged to the Imperial Navy were now controlled by the factories of America, and the tragedy was self-inflicted. Japan's naval leadership refused to adapt. They continued to believe that fighting spirit could overcome radar, production, and training. But battles aren't won by belief, they're won by preparation. In the end, doctrine became dogma, and dogma became death. One historian called it a suicide pact enforced by math. That phrase captures it perfectly. Japan had written its own fate the moment it placed faith above function. Every bomb that fell, every explosion that tore through a hangar, every lost pilot was part of an equation Japan could never solve. By the time the Imperial Navy realized the truth, its carriers were already burning across the Pacific, victims of the very philosophy that once made them great. In war, courage wins battles. But industry wins wars. By 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was discovering that truth the hard way. No amount of valor could compete with a nation capable of producing a new fleet every year. Japan had entered the Pacific War with a handful of superbly crafted ships and aircraft. America entered it with factories that could build a new navy from scratch. When the war began, Japan had 10 fleet carriers. The United States had 7, but that number was a mirage. Behind America's 7 ships stood an industrial machine unlike anything in history. Shipyards from California to Virginia roared to life, producing hulls faster than Japan could sink them. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had over 30 operational carriers. Japan, meanwhile, had fewer than 5 left, and most lacked trained crews or aircraft to fill their decks. The difference wasn't just in numbers. It was in philosophy. Japan built every ship like a masterpiece, intricate, hand-fitted, crafted to perfection. America built them like machines, modular, standardized, and endlessly repeatable. A single Essex-class carrier could be assembled in less than a year. Japan's Shokaku-class carriers took twice as long, using resources the country could no longer spare. The same imbalance appeared in the skies. Japan's famous Zero fighter was revolutionary in 1941, light, agile, and deadly. But by 1943 it was hopelessly outdated. It lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and could not absorb damage the way American Hellcats or Corsairs could. Japan knew this but couldn't fix it. Aluminum, fuel, and engines were running out. Factories bombed and mainland air raids could no longer meet demand. For every Zero Japan built, America rolled out 10 fighters, each tougher and faster than the last. And then there was fuel, the blood of any carrier force. Japan's oil supply had been cut off after the U.S. embargo in 1941. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies was supposed to solve that, but Allied submarines made sure the oil never arrived. By 1944, most Japanese carriers couldn't even train because they had no aviation fuel to spare. They could launch planes but not practice with them. When the great battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf came, Japan faced an impossible equation: inexperienced pilots, outdated aircraft, and empty fuel tanks against an enemy that had mastered the art of industrial war. America's carriers launched waves of aircraft that seemed endless. Each strike group that went out returned with another waiting to replace it. Even when the U.S. lost planes or pilots, replacements arrived in days. Japan's losses, by contrast, were permanent. Every sunk carrier represented years of effort gone in minutes. By late 1944, Japan's fleet was fighting ghosts. Carriers like Zuikaku and Zuiho sailed to battle carrying barely 24 aircraft, many piloted by teenagers with only a few weeks of training. The U.S. Navy called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese planes went up and never came back. Hundreds were destroyed in a single day. It wasn't a battle, it was extermination. The difference between the two nations could be summed up in one statistic. For every ship Japan lost, it could replace one. For every ship the U.S. lost, it could replace 10. The Pacific War was no longer a duel of navies, it was a contest of economies. Japan had gambled that quality and spirit could defeat quantity and steel. By 1944, that gamble was over. The factories of America had done what bombs and torpedoes alone could not. They broke the back of the Imperial Navy. The carriers that had once ruled the Pacific now limped toward their final battles, sailing not for victory but for death with honor. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's carrier force existed mostly on paper. The ships still floated. The decks still gleamed with rising sun emblems. But the power that once made them feared across the Pacific was gone. The few remaining carriers were hollow shells, crewed by green recruits short on aircraft and nearly out of fuel. Yet Tokyo ordered them to sea one last time. Their mission was no longer to win, it was to die well. The stage was the Philippines. The battle, Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. Japan's high command designed a desperate plan called Operation Shogo. It was bold, complex, and doomed. The idea was to use the last remaining carriers as bait, decoys to lure the U.S. Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches. While Admiral Halsey chased the decoys, Japan's battleships and cruisers would strike from behind and annihilate the American landing force. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was suicide. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the carrier decoy force, 4 flat tops including Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor raid. Between them, they carried barely 100 planes. The Americans thought they were facing a full strike force. In truth, most of Ozawa's planes couldn't even take off. Fuel shortages and untrained pilots meant the carriers were fighting empty-handed. When the battle began, the Americans took the bait. Halsey raced north with his fast carriers and battleships, eager to destroy the last Japanese carrier fleet. He found Ozawa's ships near Cape Engano. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. American Hellcats and Helldivers descended from the sky in waves. The Japanese had almost no air cover. Bombs and torpedoes ripped through steel decks that once symbolized naval power. Zuikaku, veteran of countless victories, took multiple hits and capsized after a final salute from her crew. Zuiho Chitose and Chiyoda followed her to the bottom. Nearly 600 sailors died with them. Ozawa himself survived, rescued from the water by a destroyer that would soon share the same fate. The decoy worked, temporarily. Halsey's pursuit left the invasion fleet exposed, but Japan's surface attack failed to break through. Even their greatest battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, could not turn the tide. Once again, courage met cold arithmetic. Firepower and bravery meant nothing against radar-guided strikes and overwhelming production. After Leyte Gulf, Japan's carrier fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force. What few ships remained were stripped of aircraft and fuel. Some were converted to training hulks, others left idle in home waters. The pilots who might have flown from their decks were now being trained for something else entirely, the kamikaze program. With the skies lost and no path to victory, Japan turned to desperation. Carriers that once launched elite air wings became platforms for suicide missions. Planes were launched one way, their pilots told to aim for enemy decks and never return. These were not tactical strikes. They were acts of national despair. Even the surviving carrier crews knew it. They weren't sailing to win, they were sailing to burn. By mid-1945, the last remnants of Japan's carrier arm were either sunk or crippled. Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, was torpedoed and lost on her maiden voyage, without ever launching a single plane. Amagi was bombed and destroyed while anchored in port. Her crew stayed aboard, waiting for aircraft that would never come. The Imperial Navy's carrier era ended as it had begun, with devotion and fire. But this time there would be no triumph, no victory parades, no songs of glory. The ocean that once carried Japan's dreams of empire now became their graveyard. By August 1945, the rising sun had set over a shattered fleet. The carriers that once defined modern naval warfare were gone, sacrificed to pride, strategy, and an industrial war Japan was never built to win. By 1945, Japan's once proud carrier arm was gone, sunk, bombed, or abandoned. The few that remained were gutted hulks lying in shallow harbors, their flight decks twisted by fire and shrapnel. These were not just wrecks of steel, they were the tombs of a generation. Nearly 25,000 sailors, aviators, and flight crew had perished with them. For Japan, it was not merely the loss of ships, it was the death of an idea. At the start of the war, the Imperial Navy believed that spirit could overcome arithmetic. They built their doctrine around courage, precision, and sacrifice. Their pilots were the finest in the world, experts forged through years of training and discipline. Their carriers were masterpieces of engineering, meticulously crafted and beautifully balanced. But behind all that elegance was fragility. When those veterans were lost, the system had no way to replace them. When those ships were sunk, there were no resources to build more. Japan had gambled its future on a single lightning war, and when the lightning faded, the darkness closed in. The American war machine, meanwhile, had turned war into an equation. Every loss was a number to be replaced. Every battle a calculation of fuel, steel, and manpower. Factories in Detroit and California produced ships faster than Japan could destroy them. The U.S. Navy learned, adapted, and replaced. Japan bled, resisted, and broke. The difference was not bravery, it was arithmetic. By the end of the war, Japan had commissioned 17 carriers in total. The United States had built 90. Of the 3,500 carrier-trained Japanese aviators who began the war, only about 112 were still alive by August 1945. Out of every 100 men who had once served aboard the proud flat tops of the Imperial Navy, only 9 lived to see surrender. The rest lay beneath the sea, names unspoken, ships unremembered. The final moments of Japan's carriers carried a bitter poetry. Amagi, the last operational hull, was wrecked by American aircraft at anchor. Her crew remained aboard until the end, waiting for planes that would never come, for pilots who no longer existed. When surrender finally came, they scuttled what was left of their ship. There was no fight left, only silence. In Tokyo, naval officers who had once commanded the greatest fleet in Asia now faced ruin. Some took responsibility in the traditional way, ritual suicide. Others lived long enough to write memoirs that spoke of regret and inevitability. They admitted what many had already known. The war had been lost the moment Japan chose pride over pragmatism. They had believed that courage could substitute for steel, that willpower could overcome production, and that devotion could replace training. But courage cannot outfly bullets, and spirit cannot stop bombs. For the survivors, the memory of those years remained an open wound. Many of them had watched their comrades die in flames or drown in oil-slicked seas. They had believed they were serving a cause greater than themselves. What they discovered in the end was that they had been serving an equation that could never balance. The lessons of Japan's carrier collapse would echo through naval history. Modern warfare had changed forever. Air power, logistics, and mass production, not heroism, would decide the fate of nations. The Imperial Navy's death marked the birth of a new reality. That war was no longer about who fought hardest, but who built smartest. When the smoke finally cleared over the Pacific, the United States stood as the uncontested master of the seas. Japan lay in ruins, its proud fleet reduced to memories beneath the waves. The carriers that had once symbolized ambition and dominance had become monuments to a nation's overreach. They were proof that even the fiercest fighting spirit cannot defy the cold logic of numbers. In the end, the Japanese carrier fleet did not merely lose. It performed industrial seppuku, sacrificing itself in the belief that valor could outweigh production. It was a tragedy measured not just in ships and lives, but in the haunting arithmetic of war. The Pacific grew quiet in the summer of 1945. The once thunderous skies over the ocean, once alive with the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire, fell into silence. Beneath those calm waves rested the bones of a vanished empire, steel giants that had once ruled the seas, now home to coral and memory. The war was over, but the ocean still remembered. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the conflict as a force unlike any other. It launched the attack on Pearl Harbor with precision and confidence, believing its carriers could reshape the world. For a brief moment, they did. But history is not written by moments, it is written by momentum. And Japan's momentum died the day it believed courage could replace calculation. Each carrier lost was more than metal. It was a story, a generation, a heartbeat of a nation that refused to yield. Ships like Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had carried the hopes of an empire. Their crews believed that fighting spirit could conquer any odds. But in the end, even the bravest men cannot escape the mathematics of war. By surrender day, Japan's carrier arm had vanished entirely. Its survivors, those few who lived, returned home to find nothing left. Cities burned, factories flattened, families gone. For them, the silence after the guns stopped was louder than any battle. They had given everything, and the sea had taken it all. The Americans raised their flags and rebuilt the world. The Japanese buried their dead and rebuilt their country. Out of that ruin came reflection, a recognition that honor without wisdom leads only to ashes. The carriers that once symbolized domination became lessons in restraint, humility, and the price of pride. Today, the wrecks of those ships lie scattered across the Pacific, silent witnesses to the cost of belief without balance. Divers still find remnants, aircraft parts, nameplates, fragments of uniforms. The ocean keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its truths. In the end, the story of Japan's carriers is not merely one of defeat. It is a story of transformation. From ambition to ruin, from ruin to reflection. The ships are gone, but their echoes remain. A reminder that even empires drown when they fight against the tide of arithmetic.